Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this fourth webinar in our series, Early Grade Reading Program Design and Implementation, Best Practices and Resources for Success. Here, my name is Allison Flexen, and I work with Reading Within Reach here at URC, which is based just outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. We're very excited to have everyone joining us today to learn more about the key components of early grade reading, program design, and implementation. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Adrienne Barnes from Florida State University. There's Adrienne in Florida. And we also have some colleagues from the REACH team and Global Reading Network on the Zoom interface. So the professional development series that we're offering online through the month of June and July is developed by Reading Within Reach, which is supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development and implemented by URC. I think most of you are probably aware that URC supports the Global Reading Network to develop and share research, innovations and resources, and to provide professional development around early grade reading programming. And if you are new to the GRN or it's been a while since you've visited our website, we have enhanced it in the recent past, so please go to globalreadingnetwork.net and you can sign up for the newsletter and also peruse all of the resources. You can access materials from recent webinars as well as webcasts that we record for them. So this webinar series is presented by me. I'm the Reading Program Specialist at REACH, as well as Amy Palangio, our Technical Advisor based in Tanzania, Aristarch Limo, our Training and Curriculum Specialist, who's also based in Tanzania, and Adrienne Barnes. So again, if this is your first webinar, please feel free to go back to the previous ones, which I'll bring up, and you can see some of their presentations. So the purpose of this series is really to provide this greater community of practice, which has grown to more than 4,000 people, with evidence-based information, guidance, and resources to support the design and implementation and the expansion of effective early grade reading initiatives. So we're focusing these sessions on key topics, and we're providing some summaries of the latest research, as well as the experiences that people have had around early grade reading programs to date. We know that for now, quite a few years, people are trying new things and evaluating what they are doing. And so we're trying to bring all of that information to bear and provide now some guidance and some good practices that we can all be following. We know that cross-cutting issues are also really important throughout these programs. That includes gender equity, the use of technology, and of course inclusive education that meets the needs of children with disabilities or other needs. So we've tried to integrate that throughout the different webinars, and please do share your experiences on those as well, because we have found that some of those issues are more difficult to find reports and to find evaluations. So we do appreciate when people share what they're doing in those areas. Each webinar also explores monitoring, evaluation, and issues related to expansion and sustainability of programs around that specific topic. Again, we know a lot of programs have been up and running for many years, and they're now thinking about how do they take those efforts to scale and how do they really collaborate closely with government to make sure that there is the capacity to sustain them. Throughout the webinars, you'll find opportunities for interaction and questions. We've built in a number of places where we really want you to reflect and to share what you're doing and how you might apply some of the information that we're sharing. But please, at any time, feel free to share questions and comments, because we have a number of people keeping an eye on that and can write responses, or we can also address them through the presentation. So if you haven't already joined us for the first 3 webinars, here are the topics. And as I mentioned, all of the materials are available at the GRN website, the PowerPoints and all the handouts, and we'll soon be making some recordings available as well. Today's webinar is on language considerations in early grade reading programs. We know this has been a hot topic for many years, and so we really want to give it its own time in the spotlight to talk about how language affects all of these other issues, from instructional design to resource development and teacher professional development. And then to close out July, we have one more webinar on continuous professional development that's looking at teachers. We're going to talk a lot about coaching, which is an important component of continuous professional development that we know many reading programs are implementing right now. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and register for that, and we look forward to that next week.
Allison Flepson is the REACH Reading Program Specialist. She supports the design and development of resources and professional development opportunities for the Global Reading Network. Ms. Flepson has 15 years of experience designing and managing education-related programs in Sub-Saharan Africa. Prior to joining REACH, Ms. Flepson worked for 6 years at RTI International, where she helped design and implement early grade literacy programs, assessments, training manuals, and resources. One area of particular interest to her is language use in education, especially as it relates to reading and language learning. And we get to take advantage of that and tap into some of her wealth of knowledge during this webinar.
Thanks, Adrienne. Adrienne is a literacy and pedagogy specialist at the Learning Systems Institute at Florida State University. She has more than 17 years of experience in education environments, education research in American schools, and international education and development. She currently provides technical support to several early grade reading improvement initiatives in Africa and Central America. She's been collaborating with REACH and the Global Reading Network to develop and deliver professional development related to early grade reading programs. And most recently, she presented on early grade reading skills and instruction in a webinar that we had last week. Prior to this international work, Dr. Barnes was an elementary school teacher. She received her master's and doctoral degrees from Florida State University in 2011 and 2015, where she was also a fellow with the Florida Center for Reading Research. So we welcome Adrienne, and she's going to get us started talking a bit about the objectives for this particular webinar.
Okay, so what are the objectives and why are we here? Well, language is central to any early grade reading program. It touches on every aspect of the early grade reading programs, from curriculum to materials to teacher training and assessment. This session is specifically designed to help all of those involved in early grade reading program design, implementation, and evaluation understand and navigate the many issues related to language in early grade reading programs. In this webinar, we will provide an overview of the important role that language plays in reading and language acquisition. We will discuss evidence-based benefits of providing children with instruction in a language that both they and their teachers understand, and why doing so is essential to efficient and effective reading instruction. We will also answer language-related questions that commonly arise about the design and implementation of early grade reading programs. We'll be sharing guidance, resources, and recent early grade reading program experiences that we hope you and your colleagues who are working to improve early grade reading outcomes can discuss and review together. We encourage that you and your team review Handout 15, the program planning tool, which includes questions and considerations to guide decision making. Even if your early grade reading program is already underway, the information can still be useful in looking at ongoing implementation, monitoring, and evaluating the activities that are taking place in your programs. So throughout the webinar, we will be monitoring the chat box. If you'll address your questions and comments to all panelists and attendees, anyone on our side who's available and anyone who's attending that can answer that question will be able to respond. Okay, so let's move on to part one, language issues in early grade reading programs.
So why is language a critical consideration for early grade reading improvement initiatives? Well, language and literacy go hand in hand. We know that children learn to read more easily when they learn to read in a language they already speak and understand. We also know that language-related issues are often sensitive and multifaceted. They're not confined to the classroom, but often relate to a number of sociocultural and political issues. Language is also often tied to ethnicity and other issues in the country that might impede progress on education. So it's important that we address them and that we understand them so that our reading and language programs can be effective. Addressing and integrating language issues is really critical to the success of early grade reading programs because many decisions regarding program design and implementation are related to language. For example, you might need to know what languages are you going to be using for reading instruction, how many languages should be used for language and reading instruction, when should children learn to read a second or other language if you're working in a multilingual context, and how will the approach to instruction, including the skills taught, the strategies used, and the time needed to learn different skills, need to take into account the specific languages that are being used. So we need to really integrate issues of language throughout planning, implementation, and also monitoring and evaluation. Failure to address these issues will result in a program that's likely not going to achieve its potential because we haven't really addressed these core issues around language. And lastly, but certainly not least, language is a significant factor in providing equitable and inclusive education. We know that these issues are of particular interest to USAID in its new education policy, where equity and inclusivity are emphasized. So children who understand the language of instruction are more likely to be able to access school, are more likely to attend regularly, and less likely to drop out than their peers who don't understand the language being used in the classroom. This is also particularly true for girls, who in some contexts are less likely than boys to speak and understand the language of instruction. And so this all relates to equity and to providing opportunities for all children to learn. Here I'm bringing up USAID's new Reading Matters framework. I'm going to give you just a second to read the different components across this diagram. So this is a new framework that USAID has been working on to summarize all of the critical components of reading programs and what needs to be in place to help all children read. This is not yet in a formal public document, but I know USAID is interested in getting this information out, as many of you are already familiar with these key components and have programs that are addressing them. What's important to realize is, again, that language really permeates all of these different components of early grade reading programs and is really critical to the success of them. If we start, for example, with standards and policies, we know that these are the foundations for effective use of language in education. It's important to know what is the policy for language used in school. Does that policy support effective instruction? Does the curriculum include standards related to literacy and language learning? And if not, we need to be working in our programs closely with government to try to align policies, standards, and practices for providing effective instruction that take language into consideration. Another important one is classroom instruction and assessment, which Adrian will be talking more about. Language is critical when it comes to providing effective instruction. Programs need to develop curriculum based on evidence of effective pedagogical approaches, especially for multilingual environments. If we move over to the teachers part of this diagram, what do we know about effective teachers and teaching? We know that teachers need to have knowledge and skills to teach reading in the required languages. They need to know how to teach in context where they're teaching second language learners. We also need to think about pre and in-service training and how does that address specific language considerations. So we'll be talking quite a bit about that later in the webinar. Then if we move over to text and materials, teachers can't teach and students can't learn if they don't have quality materials in appropriate languages. Programs are devoting a lot of energy into developing resources, so we're going to highlight today some of those areas where language is a particularly important thing to consider and make sure that we understand as we're developing materials. So handout 1 summarizes some of the language issues and in particular the challenges around these areas that many early grade reading programs have experienced. And so we just wanted to have these kind of summarized. You can look through them during the webinar as you're thinking about what are the challenges that you have experienced that you want to get some support on or to hear about other people's experiences as we continue through the webinar. Before we dive in, we just wanted to also provide some terminology that will guide the discussion. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term first language, which we're going to abbreviate periodically just as L1, sometimes referred to as a mother tongue in different contexts. A person can have more than one first language, and it can also be used for different purposes. We know that first language proficiency changes over time depending on when and how a speaker is using the language. We're also going to be using the term second language, L2, or other language, LX, because we know that sometimes people learn third or fourth languages or even more in many multilingual contexts. So it basically connotes any additional language that a person or a learner, as we'll be talking about, speaks and understands. Some other terms that some of you might be familiar with are dominant and non-dominant languages, official and national languages, languages of wider communication. We're not going to get too held up in terminology because we know it does differ by context. We invite you to share any comments about what's used in your context and maybe a little bit about the why. It's important to be aware that some terms may have a particularly positive or perhaps a negative connotation in your context, depending on the example. In some contexts, for example, the term mother tongue tends to be a little bit more politically charged than a term such as L1 or familiar language or home language. And so when we engage in discussions and planning around language, it's really useful to make sure we're using the appropriate terminology, but also the more contextually preferred terminology because, as we know, language matters. So as we continue to get our feet wet here, understanding language issues in early grade reading programs and how they affect what we're doing, we want to do an initial activity. So if you could bring up handout 2, because we're going to be looking at that together. So I'm going to go through how we've categorized 4 main factors to consider when addressing language issues. And we're going to be doing, you're going to be doing a little bit of a self-assessment in terms of which of these factors you've considered and applied to your early grade reading programs, and which you might need to think a little bit more deeply about to make sure you're fully recognizing and integrating into your program. So these are reading and language instruction, how we teach reading, sociolinguistic context, education context, and stakeholder considerations. So let's start talking about sociolinguistic context. This refers to the various aspects of the environment in which a language is spoken and also learned. This includes the languages and the dialects spoken in a specific geographic area, by whom, for what purpose, and to what level of proficiency. It also includes the degree to which a language has been developed or standardized for use in instruction or for reading. It's important to also recognize that the sociolinguistic context can be different within the same country. So just with that little bit of information that you understand about sociolinguistic context, I wanted you to take a minute to reflect and to indicate in that box there on a piece of paper that you have next to you, either 1, 2, or 3. Would you say you've really considered and addressed issues related to sociolinguistic context? In other words, figuring out who speaks what languages, to what degree of proficiency in your area, whether there's any dialects you need to be aware of, and whether the language's writing system or orthography has been standardized. Have you somewhat considered these issues and addressed them, or is there more that you need to learn? And if so, what do you think you might need to learn? And what have you not considered at all? Or you can categorize yourself as not really considering or address this issue at all, and so there's a lot still to learn. And again, this is just a self-assessment for some reflection, and we're going to be sort of coming back to these issues throughout the webinar. So the next one we'll talk about is education context. This refers to a country, or maybe it's just a region's, language policies, goals, and practices with respect to education and language. This might include official policies, as well as actual practices with respect to the languages used in classrooms. The education also includes student proficiency and use of different languages, information you might gather from looking at student assessment data of reading or learning outcomes. The education context with respect to language also includes teacher-related language consideration. What is their knowledge about reading, and what are their skills for teaching reading and language? What is their level of proficiency in the different languages that they're expected to be teaching and teaching in? And to what degree is there some teacher-to-student match in the classroom when it comes to language? Are teachers and students able to effectively communicate in the same language? And it also relates to the availability of teaching and learning materials in different languages. And last but not least, the amount of time that is spent teaching children to read and to learn in different languages. So there's a lot to consider with the education context when it comes to language and to be aware of. So thinking about those issues that I just mentioned and that are listed in your handout, try to categorize where you are personally or where your program is in terms of considering these different issues. And if there are any that you really are not familiar with or you think your program hasn't adequately investigated, you can jot those on a piece of paper or in the handout there. Okay, then we'll move on to reading and language instruction. This refers to how children learn to read, how they learn language and additional languages most effectively. It includes evidence regarding the critical skills that children need to be taught to learn to read, which regardless of language, but also best practices for teaching specific languages based on the characteristics of that language. It's also important that early grade reading programs understand evidence-based practices for teaching children to read in multilingual contexts. So when we have multiple languages in classrooms, what are the strategies that can be used to help all children learn? And as I mentioned, Adrian's going to be taking a deep dive into this, but just thinking about your own knowledge of evidence-based best practices for teaching reading and language, how would you self-assess in terms of whether you've really considered and addressed these issues in your programs, only somewhat or not at all? If people, again, want to self-assess, we're going to explore further stakeholder considerations, which, as you probably can guess, refers to the number of issues related to the attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs around language that parents hold, teachers, education authorities, etc., about how children learn to read and how they learn language most effectively. This also includes beliefs about speakers of different languages, the utility of learning different languages, and preferences. All of these considerations need to be taken into account as they will affect how receptive parents, teachers, and education officials are and can ultimately affect the effectiveness of your program. So again, a little self-assessment here. And if you'd like to share back anything that you are hoping to learn and how you kind of self-assessed in the chat box, I apologize for not mentioning that earlier, across these different domains. That'll give, I think, others a sense of what everyone's looking to learn, and also Adrian and I can hear from you now about what we should be touching on today or putting a little more emphasis. So I'm going to move us on now to part 2, which is effective approaches for teaching reading and language, which Adrian is going to now take over.
Let's talk about effective approaches for teaching reading and language. Once implementers understand the sociocultural context, they can begin to identify what languages can and should be used for literacy instruction. This should be based on the languages that the children already speak and understand. The skills that are taught are going to be dependent upon the specific language characteristics. For example, the sound and symbol correlations are going to be taught based on the most frequent sounds of that language. So that means if we have 2 languages of instruction, we want to begin with those sounds and symbols that are the same across both. Or if they use the same letters and symbols or the same, anything that's similar, we want to focus on those first and the most frequent sounds. When children are taught how to read in a language that they already understand and speak fluently, then learning how to read in a new language only means that they learn the sounds and symbols and the rules associated with that language. Teachers typically do not need to teach the skills that transfer, such as tracking print, blending sounds to form words, pausing at a full stop, and things like that. More skills transfer between similar languages, and fewer skills transfer between different languages. Transitioning from a first language to a second or a third language can be a difficult process, and it's highly dependent upon both oral language development and literacy in the first language, as well as those similarities between the 2 languages. reading and learning how to read is different from language learning. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit deeper, but we need to make sure that we're making time for both instruction in the language itself and instruction in how to read in that language. The language that children use for oral communication is typically the easiest language for them to learn how to read in, the process of learning how to read. When children learn how to read in a language they already understand, they're able to use their linguistic knowledge to support their emerging reading skills. This includes their knowledge of the language structure and vocabulary to decode words and determine meaning. For example, as they decode words, they're likely to know what the words mean if it's a language they already speak fluently. This ability to comprehend, in turn, creates motivation to read more. Different languages have different numbers of graphemes, either letters or symbols, and the sounds that are associated with those graphemes. Syllabic languages, which use a symbol to represent a syllable rather than a sound, typically have many more graphemes than alphabetic languages. This means that the time required to learn all of the sound and symbol correlations and spelling patterns may vary across languages. Additionally, research indicates that languages written in transparent orthographies, where a symbol only represents one sound or one syllable, are easier and take less time to learn how to read than languages with less transparent orthographies. If we look at handout number 3, benefits of instruction in a familiar language. So there are numerous benefits to teaching children how to learn to read in a language they already speak fluently. It increases their education access. It improves their learning outcomes. It supports child-centered learning and gender equity. It facilitates more accurate assessment of student learning because you're actually assessing their skill of reading. You're not assessing their language skills. It supports greater parental and community involvement in education, and it validates and preserves the culture. Handout number 4 on the next slide is an infographic that supports advocacy around language issues in education, in particular, the use of mother tongue language to support teaching and learning. I'll give you a moment to kind of look at that because it's a really great infographic. You know, there are nearly 10,000 living languages in the world, 7,000 that are documented. And so respecting that mother tongue, using that mother tongue as a basis for literacy development provides a very strong foundation for children as they have to transition later on to second or third or sometimes fourth or fifth languages. One of the biggest questions that we get when we begin an early grade reading intervention is, well, when are they going to learn to read? How long? What's the date that these children should know how to read? What semester of what grade? And the answer that we have is, it depends. The amount of time that children need to learn to read depends on several factors. It depends on the language type. Is it alphabetic, syllabic, or alphasyllabic? What is the orthography like? How many graphemes are there? How many numbers of sounds? Is the orthography deep, where one sound can be represented by multiple spellings, or one letter can represent multiple sounds? Or is it shallow, where one grapheme and one sound is all that you have? Is there tonality in the language? What is the word order or syntax? And there are multiple other complexities within the language. What is the amount of time available for teaching and learning? Because children will not learn to read if the amount of time allocated for instruction is not sufficient for them to learn to read. You know, research indicates that at least 1 hour of reading instruction per day, per language, needs to be provided, although more is better. When we talk about reading instruction, it can be any literacy activities. We want to get them working with literacy with that language for at least an hour a day. So if a child is learning 3 languages and expected to read in 3 languages, we're talking about 3 hours of reading instruction or literacy activities per day. And then quality of instruction matters. right? It's the quality of instruction. It's the teacher's knowledge of the language, their own fluency, their own knowledge in how to teach these skills. But with good instruction and good materials and plenty of practice, most children should be able to read in a familiar language by the end of grade 2. So what's the relationship between first and second language learning? Well, a solid foundation in the first language supports learning in a second or any other language. Strong literacy and language skills, as well as content knowledge in the first language, transfer to the second language to support academic achievement and successful reading comprehension. In fact, success in second language is strongly associated with oral and written proficiency in the first language. And new research indicates that children need to reach a certain level of proficiency in their first language before they are able to successfully transfer skills to a second language or third language. Teaching reading in a second or additional language too early may lead to reduced success or reading failure in both languages. Because if a child has not mastered the skills related to knowing how to read in the first language, asking him or her to learn in another language may be overwhelming. It's important to continue to build first language literacy skills even after the second language or the third language is introduced. Oftentimes we see an L1 plus L2 minus L1 model, where the second language is introduced, the children learn how to read in that, and then there's no more instruction in the first language. But it's important to continue instruction in the first language and literacy skill instruction in that language, because this allows children to think through new concepts using familiar vocabulary. And research indicates that when students are expected to produce an oral or a written product in a second language, they perform better when they're first able to discuss the content in their first language. And there's some evidence from Kenya that supports existing evidence on the importance of children acquiring strong first language skills. An analysis of third grade students' reading assessments results found that poor English language outcomes were correlated with poor reading skills in their mother tongue or their first language. Next slide. Oh, sorry, that's the evidence from Kenya. Piper and colleagues published that in 2015. All of these resources that you see listed are included in the resource list that's in the handouts folder on the Google Drive link that was shared. So you can find all of these. If links were available, they're included in that resource list. Everything that you see included and referenced will be in that resource list. Okay, so let's talk about the transfer of language and literacy skills. The Cummins model, really, this is the common underlying proficiency hypothesis that Cummins hypothesized, right? That those common underlying proficiency, there are certain things that about language and about literacy that transfer to new languages. That's going to be similar features across the languages. That's direction of print or syntax order or sounds that are the same or syllables that are the same, graphemes that are the same. Concept knowledge, knowing the life cycle of a butterfly in one language doesn't change because you learn it in a second language, you just need to learn new words. And then basic literacy skills, understanding that print represents speech and carries meaning. That only needs to be learned once, just like learning how to blend sounds to read words. All of these skills transfer to a second language. Research indicates that phonological awareness skills transfer across languages, particularly if the phonemes are similar. There are also, unique features. These are the differences. These differences can interfere with language learning and can cause confusion for the language learners. For example, if a child first learns to read in Arabic and then is later asked to read in English, he may automatically try to begin reading on the right side of the page because Arabic text flows from right to left. Therefore, teachers have to be aware of the unique features of the two languages and provide explicit instruction in the differences between the languages so that students can anticipate difficulties and they can be prepared to handle them. We spoke very briefly about this earlier, that learning to read has factors related to the language, right? The language characteristics impact how we learn how to read, but it also impacts how a child learns to read in a second or additional language. The more similar the new language is to the familiar language, the faster the process can take place, assuming, of course, that good quality instruction and time to learn the new language is sufficient. All those language variations are factors, right? For example, Kiswahili is a transparent agglutinating language, but English is not transparent and is not agglutinating. So it will likely take more time for a child to learn English if they speak Kiswahili, compared to the amount of time it would take for them to learn a language that is more similar to Kiswahili. On the other hand, a child who already knows German may find it easier to learn English, given some shared vocabulary and grammatical structures. Now, research has shown that the first language skills that a learner brings to learning a second language matter. For instance, if the learner is already fully proficient in literacy skills in one language, those basic literacy skills will transfer to the new language. If a person needs to learn how to sound out words and blend those words, they only need to do it once, right? Learning will progress quickly if the learner is already a fluent speaker of the new language. However, teachers will need to explicitly teach children which skills will transfer to the new language. Explicit, systematic instruction in language and reading skills will help the learner acquire skills in the new language, particularly when the language is used outside of the classroom setting. Teacher skill and proficiency in the second language is tied directly to both the quality of instruction and the learner achievement. If the teachers don't know how to teach the second language appropriately, or are not fluent speakers of that second language, the students are not going to learn it. Now, we've seen this as a huge issue in many contexts. English is expected to be the language of instruction at 4th grade or grade 5, but the teachers themselves actually don't speak English fluently and can't read English fluently. Therefore, they can't teach it fluently. Exposure outside the classroom is really important. So opportunities to learn that second language outside of school. Their second language acquisition will be enhanced if they are able to hear, speak, and use that language outside of the classroom in social settings as well as academic settings. So this is just a chance for us to interact with you. In the context where you work, are the evidence-based approaches to reading and language instruction we just discussed being used? If not, why? Or how might you be able to support their use? Or maybe just tell us one piece of information that you've learned today so far about effective approaches to reading and language instruction. How can you apply this information to your own work? We'll just take a few moments to take some comments. Okay, Jessica says, we do try to consider the local L1 question in our program, but in some ways are constrained by whatever the local government policy and curriculum mandates. Right, that's also, I mean, obviously, all of these recommendations and all of these guidelines have to sit within a political, socio-political context of the country and what the government wants. And I think that Allison talked earlier about, you know, what is the education context, and we obviously have to set it within that. But any plug that we can give and any support we can give to the teachers to help them understand that integrating that first language helps the children become more academically successful will be great. Yeah, we see that too, like the code switching. Teachers will naturally revert to teaching in the local language. And that's particularly common when they're expected to teach in a second language, but they themselves don't fluently speak it. So we've actually gone in and taught with students, and they're expected to be speaking in English, but none of them understood a word we were saying because the teachers teach in the mother tongue language because they themselves don't have the English skills. Wilfred said, I learned the importance of continuing with L1 as you move to and continue with L2. We'll do it with appropriate teachers. Right, so we want to continue with L1 because, like I said, even though they've learned that second language, it takes years and years to become fluent and to really be able to express thoughts and really think in that language. So when we give students the opportunity to think in the language that they use, that they're most familiar with, that's their basis for communication, it allows them to be more successful. And we want to continue developing that vocabulary and developing those thinking skills in their first language.
This is Allison. I just wanted to address one of the comments about lack of instructional time being a big issue. I think we've heard this a lot from early grade reading programs. And just in relation to Christina's comment too about these constraints of existing policies and practices, but trying to sort of push the dial or move the dial or improve things. In a small scale pilot in northern Nigeria that I was involved with several years ago, you know, we did try something new with instructional time allocation. And this was, again, if the current way of doing things isn't working, let's try something new on a small scale and evaluate it really well to see if we might get some different outcomes. And the outcomes were better when teachers had more time to teach reading, among other things. And this actually resulted in a local government changing the amount of time that was available for instruction. So I think that shows this kind of sustained effort over a good amount of time to develop an intervention, pilot it, and make the case for a change can achieve what you'd like to do, you know, over a longer term versus just right away trying to change a policy and practice doesn't often work. We need to trial a new approach first and have some evidence to make that case. Go through some steps to take to effectively incorporate language throughout an early grade reading program. This is not necessarily to say that there are sequential steps or that there are not additional steps, but we're just sort of numbering them as terms of things to do at some point, some concurrently, some are iterative, some we need to come back to multiple times during the course of program design, implementation, and modification later on. So the first important aspect of engaging people in language issues is really to bring together the diverse stakeholders at all stages of the process. We know this idea of stakeholder engagement, sometimes it seems a bit trite or this kind of phrase that we use, but we really wanted to underscore how important it is around language. We know that stakeholders have attitudes and knowledge and beliefs about language that they bring to the table. People often, of course, think about how they were educated and what was their personal experience and outcomes. And of course, parents want what they perceive to be best for their children, and that is all important to take into consideration when we think about designing programs and how to get new ideas tested and how to possibly make changes to the system. So any sort of work on early grade reading programs need to include some kind of assessment of stakeholder attitudes, knowledge, and beliefs. We should assume that we know what these are. Often there is kind of assumptions, and then we get into our program design and implementation, and we find new things. And it's useful if we do that sort of from the get-go so that we can really be addressing those throughout the process of program development and implementation. It's also really critical to involve stakeholders in information gathering, analysis, decision-making, and planning. Direct involvement in all those different activities that we need to do can build awareness, can gain acceptance of any results that we're finding from the research or from our pilot implementation, and also obtain consensus on how to go about addressing particular language issues. So involving government personnel, teachers, parents in things like language mapping or early grade reading assessment, data collection can be very powerful. And I know many programs have seen that to be the case in terms of bringing people on board to trying new approaches that relate to languages. It can also help to decrease the politicization of language. If people are engaged in collaborative planning, in gathering evidence, it can kind of take the heat away from that aspect of language issues and facilitate decision-making and consensus around what people have seen and the evidence that they have gathered. And the last is to provide professional development opportunities to build knowledge and skills. We sometimes assume that just kind of involvement somehow automatically provides people with an opportunity to learn, and that can be true, but there has to be a real intentional planning for that capacity development to take place. So that includes learning the evidence that Adrian presented on how children learn to read and how they learn language most effectively. It might include talking more about orthography and how specific languages need to be taught in specific ways. And if we're having bilingual instruction in reading, that we need to think about explicit ways of teaching children to transfer skills. And so all of these can be very technical topics, but they need to be communicated with the different stakeholders that need to be on board to allow a pilot effort to move forward, or to allow these policies and existing ways of doing things to change. So building that time into your program is useful. And if you're a program that's already well underway, I don't think we should ever feel discouraged that something didn't happen or we didn't do it to begin with, but it's to use this opportunity as we're going along and learning more things to say maybe we do need to have some kind of workshop or a dissemination event or some kind of one-on-one professional development opportunities around specific language issues that we see we're encountering. Here's an example of just that type of engagement, of understanding stakeholder considerations, and in particular working with government. The Global Reading Network had a webinar for International Mother Language Day last February called Language Policy Planning and Practice in Early Grade Reading Programs. And government representatives and different program implementation organizations shared their experiences from Ethiopia, Nepal, and the Philippines. And these were very insightful on how some of the challenges that they encountered, but then some of the successes that were achieved. Some important takeaways from those presentations were, again, that decisions about language and how it's used in education weren't just about pedagogy, that politics also really mattered. For example, in Nepal, they were engaging in a new constitution, and that really affected the early grade reading program, believe it or not. So they had to work within those political parameters, but they've been able to overcome some of those obstacles. And they all emphasized also the need to conduct thorough background research on understanding socio-political factors, realities on the ground, as plans were developed. And in many cases, in Nepal in particular, plans were really revamped based on what was originally thought to be the case. So if you're interested in accessing those experiences, they are rich, I think, in terms of understanding what programs have dealt with and what might be applicable in your situation. The materials are on the GRN website, and the URL is in your resources and reference list, and there's also a recording of those. The second important point, circling back to those 4 considerations that we talked about earlier, is understanding the country's educational context. So this includes, becoming familiar with education and learning goals. Countries often have, national education plans, and that they outline education and learning goals. And it's good to be familiar with those and see how do they relate to language. Is language mentioned at all in the learning, the learning goals? Often it's not, and so it's a useful opportunity to say, well, how do we help children in this context achieve the country's learning goals? That gets into a discussion about language and how children learn most effectively. We talked about policies and practice. These often differ, and so it's important to do that background research and understanding where there might be a disconnect and bringing that to the attention to think about how we can improve. Political issues we mentioned, access and learning outcomes as they relate to language. This is where it's important to be aware of data in your country on enrollment and also how that may differ between different groups. Is it equitable across languages or different regions, which maybe if you don't have language-specific outcomes, you might think of it in terms of regional outcomes that are associated with different language groups. But even many of the learning assessments that are conducted now do collect demographic data on home language, early grade reading assessments, that's typical, and also even international standardized assessments like PEARLS have information on home language, and they produce reports indicating that when home language differs from the language of assessment, which is usually the official language of instruction, there is a disparity in language outcomes with kids who don't speak that language of instruction at home. being at a disadvantage. So having that data at least can help us to inform dialogue about why, if you're in a situation where children aren't being taught in familiar languages, that you may need to try something new. Teacher and student language proficiency, available learning materials, we touched on and we will get into more in depth, but also past experiences planning and implementing language-related policies and plans. It's always important to recognize that efforts around language this isn't the first time a country has probably gone through an effort to discuss language or has changed their language of instruction policy. I think Ghana has changed theirs like 10 times in the past couple of decades. And so being aware of those experiences and how were they perceived, where did that leave a country in terms of their openness or not to talking about language is all good to be aware of as we move to thinking about language within the context of reading. The other main factor we talked about earlier was sociolinguistic context. So to inform program design and implementation, we really need to spend a good amount of time and energy to gather information about language and dialect spoken, who speaks them and where. Ethnologue is an online resource some of you might be familiar with that has some basic information. Locally available reports or census data might have it as well, but it's often outdated and usually not specific to the community or school level, which is where in the end we need to be very aware of what languages are spoken. I also wanted to highlight the issue of dialect because this is something that's being raised in early grade reading programs too, when you have contexts where multiple dialects of a language might be spoken and there is not always consensus around whether or not different instructional approach and different learning materials are needed. So it's important to engage with linguists and reading specialists to understand if dialectical differences might require new or separate additional materials. It'd be nice to see small-scale piloting when this is found to be the case to see if it is helpful to have materials for different dialects or not. Another piece of information is the percentage of children and students whose home language is an official language of instruction or other languages. This is just such a critical data point to have to identify where learners are experiencing particular difficulties due to language. As I mentioned, this data is out there if we look around for it, and it's something that the Equity Initiative, which is led by Save the Children and FHI 360, is emphasized as one of their important pieces of information to gather around equity is language, among many other things. So it's something that's become more standardized to gather. And lastly, this teacher language proficiency and the issue of whether teachers and students speak the same language. So to gather all of that information, conducting a language map is something that many USAID-funded early grade reading programs are now doing, sometimes many years after they've already designed and implemented a reading program, because they have found that they don't necessarily know what is happening in the classrooms, what resources and what languages need to go to what schools, and how we might also be thinking of teacher placement in schools around language a little bit more intentionally to make sure we have better student and teacher language map. I wanted to call your attention to handout 5. This highlights some very recent experiences around language mapping. One I'll just share here with you was the experience recently in Afghanistan, where a language mapping exercise was conducted to understand the linguistic landscape in and around specific schools. This was meant to better understand what the current practices were under the country's current language of instruction policy, which mandates the use of either Dari or Pashto for instruction. So they engaged in an effort to collect data, and I want to again underscore this was Afghanistan, so of course there were a number of challenges, but I think it's important to see that even in this kind of more difficult context, they were really able to gather useful information through classroom observations, interviews with principals, teachers, and students, also focus groups with parents, and student assessment data. And they found that there was a much greater language diversity than had been assumed by the government, with students in many areas not speaking that language of instruction. That dialect issues were also important because they didn't match the text that they found in learning materials. And that teachers were employing different strategies to help students learn when they didn't speak the official language of instruction. So to somebody's point earlier about that teachers know that they can't teach effectively if they're not teaching in a language students understand. So, the program is now sort of using some of that information to move forward and think about what other languages might need to be used, or what can we do to support kids as second language learners of these languages that are being used for reading. So again, I would highly recommend these summaries if you haven't done a language mapping exercise in your country and you want to convince the people in your country that this could be a useful exercise to your project. There's some great examples and PowerPoints and explanations of how countries have gone about this. The next step is relates to reviewing and analyzing orthography. So orthography being the written representation of a language, how do we write it? Identifying whether it has been standardized and is ready to be used for instruction. So that means identifying whether there's multiple forms of writing, ways of writing a language within a country. This can happen in situations where a language hasn't been previously used for instruction, or maybe the orthographies were developed in very separate parts of the country by different organizations over time, and they may not be harmonized. We know we need to do that for teaching and learning, that we need to have one agreed upon way of teaching and writing the language. Another important step to take is identifying how language characteristics will influence how reading is taught. Adrian talked about this. Languages differ. While there's best practices across language that children, for example, need to understand sounds of the language, languages may have a different number of sounds. There may be a variety of issues that affect specifically how that language is taught. And linguists and reading specialists are invaluable in helping to understand that and designing and adapting a program appropriately. I've highlighted here some handouts that you received that can help you do this if you haven't already engaged in this process. SIL has developed an orthography assessment tool that can be useful as a starting point for engaging in a discussion around orthography assessment. I just wanted to underscore again that this issue of orthography assessment isn't something that, just anyone can undertake. Of course, it involves these specialists, and this tool is just kind of a basic framework for guiding programs. I also wanted to highlight handout 7, which is a case study from Uganda about orthography standardization. Uganda was a country that developed reading materials in quite a number of languages. I think it was 12. But they found that several of the languages had not been standardized. So they couldn't move forward on developing materials until they engaged in that process. It was a very intensive process that was supported by the USAID Reading Project, but it had really tremendously positive outcomes in terms of bringing the community around issues of language, understanding the importance of using the languages in the classroom, but then also making sure that they were in the appropriate state to use for development. Adrian talked already about identifying similarities and differences between languages that will be taught simultaneously. This can help to inform instruction and also to give you a sense of how much time is needed to teach these languages. Again, if they're very different, it may take a lot longer than may have been assumed in the current curriculum. And so trying a new curricular approach will be helpful in assessing that. I'm going to highlight a few more experiences, and I'm just so happy that there's so much being shared now at the CIS conference and other just reports and things that are going out where people are talking so much more about these issues than they were in the past. This presentation from Nepal talks about balancing linguistic and contextual factors in Nepal, where they did need to think about alpha-syllabic languages that were used in Nepal and how to teach them appropriately. In Ghana, there's a great presentation by Barbara Trudell on the role of linguistics, bringing together lots of Ghanaian linguists and thinking about the current state of the language and how those languages should be taught. And this was, again, after many years of trying to do this already, but kind of going back to the drawing board as they were revising materials to making sure that these linguistic characteristics were accounted for. And the next one is about the Khmer instruction in Cambodia. I just am highlighting here an example from practice. Khmer is a very complex language in terms of the number of graphings that need to be taught. It's a very dense script. There's a lot of similarities between letters. And so Room to Read engaged in a process to review the language with in-country experts and to develop a new approach to teaching it. Again, getting back to this issue of trying something new because there is already a government, official curriculum for teaching the language. But, they know from assessment data that children really still aren't learning to learn to read as well as they could be. And so they trialed a new approach that introduced the letters and sounds in a different way to make it more efficient and hopefully productive for children to be able to read more quickly. And that research and that trial has now informed a more expanded approach that USAID is supporting with Room to Read and a number of other partners to teach reading in Cambodia. So again, kind of getting a foot in the door, trying something new, and using the research and evidence we know to support that new approach. So we're going to stop and pause here, again, to try to reflect on what I've just been talking about and what you've all been doing. So thinking about your work, what information have you gathered or that you might plan to gather about the sociolinguistic and educational context? So all we need to know about language and language use in education systems. Share a little bit about what you gathered and how you did it and what effect that had on program design and implementation. Were you really able to use some of that information to develop a more sound approach to instruction or to think about how you were training teachers? And if there's any information gaps that you still have, share those and any thoughts about how you might go about finding answers to some of those questions you still have. And you can please share them in the chat box there. And it looks like Lydia had a comment, I think maybe kind of on the thread that's been going on about language learning and that we do really need to focus our attention on teachers' use of appropriate language, and I think we wholeheartedly support that. I think I would add to that that even if parents may not speak the language, like a second language like English or French, which would be fairly common in many contexts, that we still work with parents to help them understand how their continued support for helping children learn and gain a good foundation in that home language, if that's the one used in school for first language instruction, can be really valuable. Adrienne mentioned building oral language skills, vocabulary, and even helping parents understand just the importance of providing children with time at home to read or to do other language building and literacy building skills, and that they understand that that can, create that bridge between home and school that supports their learning of both first and second and other languages. I would be curious to know if there are any other programs out there than the ones that I highlighted that have done language mapping, and if you have if you have some experience to share about any challenges you encountered, or if you were, how you were able to use the information, or if you're kind of sitting there going, you know what, we really need to do that, and that might be something that you could do in some way to inform your program. Wilfred, I think you bring up an important point about this issue of private schools, that in a lot of contexts it's typical that private schools do not provide instruction in L1, mother tongue, home languages, with this sort of usually based on this idea that they might not be aware of the benefits of providing L1-based instruction and how it's really such an important foundation to bridge to those other languages. I know USAID does not typically work in private schools, but that's not the case everywhere. And it's, of course, true that efforts around advocacy, communications on language issues, which we'll talk about more, could be targeted towards the educator community more broadly, and we could help those messages get out to all educators in the country. There's also this sort of sometimes conflation or lack of ability to take apart what is affecting what is sometimes higher achievement in private schools more related to socioeconomic status than necessarily the language of instruction. It's a complicated issue, but I think it just is important that we recognize that messages about effective instructional approaches can benefit the whole country's education system if we're engaging in those discussions. Well, if there aren't any more comments right now on what we just talked about in the steps 1 through 4, I'm going to now transition back to Adrian, who's going to talk more about language-related issues and decisions around instruction.
Thank you, Allison. So step 5 is actually identifying the languages to be used for instruction. And doing that, identifying which languages, it's a decision that requires information about multiple issues, right? Allison has already talked about the sociolinguistic context and how findings from language mapping can identify which languages are spoken by a large portion of the population, as well as which languages are spoken by a minority or marginalized groups. And they might be critical to include to address disparities in education across outcomes that exist. But the learning goals, it's important to understand what a country hopes to achieve in terms of its education goals, as well as the language learning goals. These can help support decisions related to the languages used for reading instruction. Orthography readiness. A language cannot be used for reading instruction if its orthography has not been standardized for use. The readiness of some languages over others may guide the sequencing of languages for use in an early grade reading program. Some languages are more similar to each other than others. It may be more efficient to develop materials for languages that are similar to each other than those that are significantly different. Programs should also plan for the use of sign language and Braille so that we're including children with disabilities. The existence of appropriate early grade reading materials, as well as necessary human resources to roll out a program, may also affect which languages are identified for use in an early grade program, at least during the initial part of the program. And then it also may depend on the amount of funds and time available. It's important, though, to remember that each additional language may not necessarily cost the same amount, since some costs will be the same no matter how many languages are included, while others may apply to each language separately. Strong oral language skills provide a framework for building literacy skills. Children who learn to communicate well and have well-developed vocabularies will learn to read easier, have better comprehension of what they read, and have more skills that will transfer when learning a second language or additional language. Since L1 knowledge and skills support second language learning, students should be encouraged to continue learning and developing academic skills in the L1 as they transition. Additionally, for some language and in some contexts, little evidence exists regarding exactly how and when it's most effective for children to transition from learning in one language to learning in a new language. Therefore, transition decisions have to be made based on the context, on teachers' language and instructional skills, on children's skills, and on contextual factors such as the amount of time and materials allocated for instruction. Once a decision has been made and an instructional approach has been developed, it should be rigorously evaluated to determine if the timing and approach to transition is effective. We want to support gradual transition, learning to read in the second or the additional language. This is another example from practice. It's a brief overview of the Philippines model for language learning. So we see mother tongue, Filipino language, and English language. Starting at the beginning of grade 1, quarter 1, children are reading, writing, and using that mother tongue as a language of instruction for all subjects. But very early in grade 1, they begin learning the Filipino language orally, and then they also begin learning English orally. At the start of grade 2, they begin reading and writing instruction in Filipino, and halfway through grade 2, they begin reading and writing instruction in the English language. Now, some aspects of this approach that are evidence-based and represent global best practices include introducing the oral language before introducing reading and writing, and staggering language introduction. However, if they were to space the new languages like Filipino and English across multiple years instead of introducing them both in the first year, that may provide a better opportunity for success, as well as providing more time building the oral language skills before introducing reading and writing. Something else that's interesting is we want to make sure that they're continuing to develop that oral language once the reading and writing begins, that the language skills instruction continues as well as the reading and writing instruction in all languages. So how do you develop an instructional approach that's based on evidence, context, and the languages? It begins with the development of a scope and sequence. And when developing a scope and sequence for the second or other language, we want to first focus on the language features that are similar across languages, and then explicitly begin teaching the features that are dissimilar. This means that language type, language properties, language orthographies need to be well understood and analyzed for similarities and differences, because the orthographic characteristics will impact phonological awareness instruction, phonics instruction, and decoding instruction and decodable text that's developed for the students. Time allocations should be made for both language instruction and reading instruction. These two topics should be taught separately for each language being taught in 2 separate time blocks, using different materials, and implementing different yet synergistic instructional strategies. Why I say using 2 different materials? Because when we are teaching language, we are focusing on vocabulary development, syntax development, using the language for speaking and listening. When we're talking about reading instruction, it's very specific. It starts very basic as far as letter sound correlations. And so the materials that'll be needed for reading instruction are going to be different materials that are going to be needed to build that oral language. Make sure that you have reading specialists and language specialists that can identify how to most appropriately teach reading in each language that's introduced. Now, Nakamura and Hoop published this study that was funded by USAID's All Children Reading Grand Challenge Initiative back in 2016. And they found that children were more successful reading in a second language when they were able to acquire a certain level of proficiency of certain skills in their first language, right? So it's this language threshold idea. This means that the level of skill in the first language needs to reach a certain level. It could be a certain number of words reading per minute. It could be a certain number of types of spelling patterns or a certain complexity of spelling patterns in that first language in order to be successful at reading at the second language. And this threshold level and the characteristics of that threshold level are going to vary depending upon the 2 characteristics, the characteristics of the 2 languages being learned. And it goes back to all of those things that we've been talking about specific language characteristics. But it's important to engage in this type of research in the different countries, in the different projects, to really determine what is the threshold. At what point are children able to successfully transition to a new language, and which languages are the first and the second languages. We have another example from practice here, and this is about bilingual reading trajectories in Guatemala. It was a longitudinal study of children where they compared expected growth versus actual growth in their first and second language skills. And it's important to recognize that children's reading skills, they will not develop at the same pace when they're learning in multiple languages. Depending at the point at which a second or additional language is introduced and the types of instruction received, children might be able to develop bilingual literacy by the middle elementary grades, but they're not going to develop at the same pace, and they're not going to develop oftentimes on the trajectory that we expect them to develop, because it really does depend upon the quality of instruction, the quality of their interaction with the language, the quality of their activities. And in Guatemala, these results were used to develop policy and practice recommendations to improve their literacy and language instruction. So they changed their expected trajectories based on what was actually happening in the country with the children that were going through these programs. So it's important, once you've got this program developed, it's important to continue to assess. Are children acquiring the language and literacy skills according to the plan? Do we need to adjust the approach? Is teacher professional development effective? Are other aspects of the program effective? And I think we're going to go back to Allison to talking about developing language-specific resources.
Great, thank you, Adrienne. I just wanted to note to our participants with respect to that last slide on language thresholds and the USAID supported research in India. I just noticed we have the report author joining us. So if anyone has specific questions around those issues, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them. It's great to have all these experts available to support the work. So we're going to segue now to thinking about how we take all that we know about orthography and how children are learning instructional approaches and really bring that all to bear on developing language-specific resources. We all know this is where so much time and energy gets spent on developing teaching and learning materials. And we had an entire webinar on this topic a few weeks ago. So if you would like to get a real deep dive into it, please check out that online. But I'm going to highlight just some of the language-specific elements of resource development, if that's even possible when we know so much is language related. But we're really going to focus just on that here. So the first really important thing to do is, of course, involving language-specific teams, authors, teachers, community members, language specialists, and even students in the design, development, and piloting of resources in specific languages. We often hear it's too difficult to develop resources in different languages, in multiple languages in a country, but we do have experience from many countries, Ghana, Ethiopia, Uganda, to name just a few, that have successfully developed materials in many languages for programs. So, one of the important takeaways from some resources from those countries has shown is that really having these these teams specific to language with these different skills and stakeholder groups is really valuable. The other important thing is around conducting an inventory of materials. Finding out what is available in a country is first and foremost something you have to do. Often there are materials in various languages that exist. They may or may not be appropriate for an early grade reading program, but they can be analyzed. We can look at the quality and the appropriateness. Conducting an orthography review, as we just previously talked about, is an aspect of resource development that we need to do. And now there's more and more technology that we can use to support materials development in different languages. The USAID All Children Reading Grand Challenge for Development supported the development of the Bloom software to inform development of the scope and sequence of reading programs, basically what is taught and how and when it's taught, and to develop controlled text, so decodable books, level books. Again, we talk a lot about these in the webinar 2 of this series, what those are and what are markers of good quality, decodable and level books and text. So software is out there that can support this kind of really fast-paced development of materials in multiple languages. And more programs are sharing their quality control tools and processes that support production of materials across languages. Developing materials in one language is challenging, and there has to be a quality control element to it, that when you're talking about multiple languages at one time, it becomes even more paramount that there are really clear processes and tools that are used to make sure that materials are equally well developed across multiple languages. So the resources on this slide are, I think, really good ones to supporting materials development and taking all those things I mentioned into consideration. Handout 9 is a presentation that talks, again, about the role of linguistics in content and materials development. Handout 10 lists even more language-specific considerations for reading program materials development. Handout 11 it summarizes some of the multilingual digital libraries that are out there. If you haven't, checked these out, they're just wonderful repositories that have really bloomed in the past few years to bring together openly licensed material. So we aren't always starting from scratch with new story ideas and completely new illustrations, that in many contexts we can build off of what's already developed, adapt it, and now that materials are being openly licensed, that process is even easier to do. So handout 11 talks about those multilingual digital libraries. The next one is developing materials in 11 languages in Ghana. This is one of my favorite presentations in terms of just walking people through the nitty-gritty details of what you have to do when you bring together literally hundreds of people to develop materials in this many languages and to do it well. So this program has shared their fillable templates and tools and process maps that you can look at. And if you are engaged in this process or are going to be, I just would highly recommend it because it's so informative, talking about the pitfalls and the successes of that process. The Enabling Writers Program, we have resources listed in the resources and references sheet. That was also supported by USAID to try the Bloom software in 6 countries. REACH and the Global Reading Network worked with 6 organizations to develop more than 3,000 texts across, I think it was 15 languages. So we have some resources that talk about that process and working with local author teams to do that. I already mentioned Webinar 2 has a lot of resources as well on materials development that relate to language, and the text box there just highlights some of the software if you're not already familiar with it. SIL provides a lot of fonts and language analysis software and shell books, and if you are struggling right now even just to type your particular language, they provide some guidance again on how to do that effectively. So from where the early grade reading work started about 10 years ago, we've come very far, I think, in understanding the language considerations from the technology standpoint all the way to book production and orthography. So please familiarize yourself with some of these resources if you haven't already. So we're going to segue now to thinking about teachers and language, and what do we need to think about with respect to language when we are trying to support effective teaching and teachers. So to be effective, teachers need to be able to communicate with students in a language they understand. They need to speak, read, and write in the language they're teaching. They need to know about the particular orthography that they're teaching, the sound structure, the spelling patterns of the language. So it's not just a matter of speaking it, but it's also a matter of really understanding it from a deeper linguistics perspective. They need to be able to apply evidence-based best practices for teaching children to read in different languages. They need to be knowledgeable about how you teach children to read a second or other language if that's something that is expected of them. And they also should be, respectful of the language and the language speakers that are teaching. So this kind of circles back to this idea of understanding what different stakeholder beliefs might be around language and language speakers to see if there are issues around there that we need to be aware of. So translating all of this into effective teacher professional development is something that early grade reading programs need to be really cognizant of. And a first important step is to assessing teacher language and literacy knowledge, skills, and practices. We'll have some examples on the next slide about programs that have done that. This is really a new area, I would say, in early grade reading programs. It was this sort of assumption that teachers either sort of already know the language or an assumption that they don't at all and that they don't bring any necessarily relevant language and literacy skills and practices. But more programs are doing really intentional assessments of teacher knowledge and skills around language, and this is really informing their teacher professional development approach. Including language-specific issues in teacher professional development, both pre-service and in-service. This includes, teaching teachers the difference between literacy and language instruction, as Adrienne mentioned, effective instructional approaches, how to support transfer of skills from one language to the other, and also making sure that what teachers are learning in pre and in-service is aligned. Teachers don't often have opportunities, even in pre-service training, to receive, their teacher education in the languages that they're going to be using in their classrooms, and that's something that we need to work to change. If we're expecting teachers to go into classrooms to teach those languages, they should be learning themselves in those languages. Providing teachers with teaching and learning materials in the appropriate languages. So thinking about teacher guides, and are they in the languages that they're using for instruction or not? Because if they aren't, they will need to have resources that support the languages of instruction. And lastly, providing opportunities for teachers to improve their literacy and language skills. So it's recognized through assessment and observation that teachers themselves may not be fluent readers of these languages they're expecting to teach. So what are some innovative and interesting opportunities that teachers can have to enhance their own literacy and language skills? And if some of you, have grappled with that issue, we would really like to hear from you, what you're doing. So this example from practice is a handout. Actually, these examples from practice, are summarized in handout 12, Assessing Teacher Language and Literacy Skills. There's a couple of 3 countries that have presented or have reports or something to share what they've specifically done to assess teacher knowledge, skills, and practices to inform teacher professional development, the content, even thinking about teacher placement issues, where teachers go, what schools they are assigned to teach. This really requires thoughtful planning and appropriate tools. Obviously, assessing teachers is a really sensitive issue. We've seen how it can backfire and have very negative outcomes in countries where teacher assessment is used in a punitive way, where teachers have been even fired. So it has to be well thought through, and the purpose and how information gathered is used has to be monitored very, very closely, so that it can be used to help teachers and not in any way, harm their ability to teach or their status as teachers. So on that note, we'll just take a couple of minutes to reflect on your experiences around teacher professional development. How have teacher professional development needs specific to language been addressed in your early grade reading work? Have their language and literacy skills been assessed? Share any experiences you have around this, things that you're seeing, things you think that you need to do to actually better understand teacher language and literacy knowledge and skills, and what you might be able to do to improve their language and literacy skills. I see we've been having an engaging discussion around issues, trilingual approaches. We're going to share some research on that just shortly here. Kate, so thank you for bringing up this issue. Eunice commented that in their workshops, they found there was a need to spend about half the time on teachers practicing their own literacy skills in the first language, and then half the time on pedagogical skills. Eunice, thanks for sharing that. I think this, just speaks to the point that we really need to focus perhaps more than we have been on supporting teachers. You can imagine how difficult it must be for a teacher to stand up in front of a classroom and teach a language they don't feel comfortable teaching. That would be very difficult and demoralizing, and then you risk, of course, that teachers don't want to implement an L1 approach to instruction. So some assessments and maybe piloting ways in which teachers can get that support and feel confident in the classrooms is really important. Todd comments that AAR has conducted early grade reading teacher competency assessments using classroom observation and written assessments with instructional skills and language skills. Thanks, Todd, for sharing that. If you have any reports that describe those efforts, I know it's always great to read about methodology and tools and how that kind of data is used. I'm glad to see more of that done. Incorporating language into early grade reading program monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning is something we've all wanted to highlight. We don't often see language explicitly talked about or mentioned or incorporated into early grade reading program monitoring and evaluation, but it can really shed a lot of insight into what is working, what is not, with respect to instruction and student outcomes across languages. So some important actions that you can take in your programs if you want to do a better job of thinking and understanding language issues and incorporating them into your moral framework is first and foremost to monitor fidelity of implementation, specifically around language. So it's important to know whether teachers are actually implementing your reading program as it was intended, specifically around language. Are they able to read the teacher guides in the languages that you're providing? Are they code switching in the classroom and altering the lesson plans in any way? So that fidelity of implementation is important because later if you have results of a program, you can at least go back and say, well, were teachers actually implementing that L1 approach to instruction or not? It's also important to disaggregate outcomes by school and home language. I mentioned that earlier. That can really help to identify different outcomes based on language and whether some children are disadvantaged or the instruction approach is not meeting their needs. And this can be an important piece of evidence when you want to talk about modifying policy or modifying practice if you're showing some learners are being left out of the current approach, that something should be changed. Conducting relevant research. So there's a lot we still don't know about the best ways to teach different languages, how to teach children to read and learn in multilingual contexts, how to transition or support second and third language learning when we're talking about very specific languages, like from X language in X country to this other language, that we need a lot more research to identify how long that takes and then what are the language thresholds that we need to know when children are ready to bridge into learning other languages. So this is where these kind of small-scale proofs of concept or pilots can be particularly useful in shedding light and creating the evidence. Longitudinal studies are research studies on a small sample of students tracking their language progression over time across languages and grades. We can't, I think, emphasize enough that these are really important, and I think there tends to be this idea that they're too difficult, but there are longitudinal research studies underway, and I think they're showing that they are feasible if we really, design them well. And even if they are smaller scale, they can provide really rich information about, the instructional approaches and how well children do over time, which is what we need to know. Identification of language-specific benchmarks. Benchmarks are target goals for achievement in different skills. They depend, they're going to be language dependent. Room to Read and RTI and others have done quite a bit of thinking about this and developed some resources on the process and limitations of different methods of developing benchmarks. So if you're developing those for your country, I recommend you check out those resources, which are listed in the reference page. I skipped over one about reporting language results appropriately. This is something to highlight if you are in a country where multiple languages are being taught and you're reporting your reading outcomes across these different languages, that we do so in an appropriate way. Just reporting oral reading fluency across languages is going to likely create some problems when in terms of comparing how children are doing across those languages, because languages differ. And so there are some best practices around doing that so we don't accidentally fall into a conclusion of X language group is doing better than others when really we're kind of comparing apples to oranges with our data. And so there are better ways to do that around like percentage of children who are scoring 0 on certain types of EGRA assessment subtasks that may be more appropriate if we're trying to understand any disparities in outcomes in order to help different language groups achieve parity of outcomes. But we need to be really, really cognizant of that because it can create some negative outcomes in countries if we start trying to make assumptions about how different language groups are doing. And then lastly, using the findings to adapt our approach, our teacher professional development and our materials. So not just having findings for the sake of findings, but really saying, okay, well, this is how children are doing, and why is that? Is the instructional approach not adapted to their language? Is teacher professional development insufficient, to help teachers teach, in a bilingual classroom? Do the materials reflect what the kids need in terms of becoming successful language speakers or readers? And then informing policy and practice. So reflecting on your Moral Plan, if you're not familiar with it, because you're not the monitoring and evaluation specialist, finding out what's in it, figuring out what can be adapted. If you're in the process of looking at yours, modifying it, it's important to have language and reading specialists in the room when that monitoring and evaluation plan is being developed, because they may be able to flag how you could be better researching and evaluating language-specific issues. Now I want to go back to a slide I skipped over quickly because it was slightly out of place, around evaluating a multilingual approach to instruction in the Philippines. So Adrian brought up a slide that summarized the instructional approach to the trilingual approach in the Philippines around an L1, Filipino, and English. And that approach was designed, taking best practices around trying to help children bridge to learning different languages. So it was a very well thought out approach. But then a couple years after implementing it, they went back and said, well, we need to evaluate whether this approach is working. Is it effective? And so the Philippines Department of Education requested the support of USAID in implementing that mother tongue-based multilingual approach of learning 3 different languages, with the assumption or the intention, the objective, that by the end of grade 3, children would be proficient enough in English, which would be a second or third language to most of the children, to be used for instruction of math and science, and Filipino for other subjects. And then subtracting out the first language and no longer teaching first language beyond grade 4. So after a few years, you can see the findings summarized here on the right. They found that fluency in the first language was associated with higher fluency in the second language, and even the third language. So this supports the existing evidence around the utility of creating a strong foundation in a first language to support additional language acquisition. But they found also that most students weren't acquiring sufficient proficiency in Filipino or English to transition to learning in those languages by grade 4, which was, of course, the ultimate goal. So something isn't quite working with the instructional approach or the teacher professional development or the materials to allow children to do that. And importantly, children for whom Filipino was not their mother tongue or first language weren't catching up to the speakers of Tagalog, which is the basis for Filipino. So there were inequitable outcomes that not all children were equally able to access, learning in these languages by grade 4 because their home language was not Filipino, and they weren't able to catch up. So the conclusion of the evaluation was that, this expectation of a trilingual approach and that children would become proficient in 3 languages by the end of grade 3 isn't realistic. And so there were some recommendations about slowing down that transition perhaps, and providing a continued support in the L1 beyond grade 3. So again, some good research to think about how we adapt what we're doing and even possibly modify existing policies and practices. Okay, and our last sort of step or major consideration that we'll talk about today is around communication and advocacy on language issues. So we've talked about all along that addressing language issues requires that all of those involved in designing and implementing programs have an understanding, capacity, and consensus around these issues. So ways in which we can do that include developing a communications and advocacy strategy. We don't often think of that as sort of integral to early grade reading programming. We think first and foremost around, developing our scope and sequence and our materials and designing teacher professional development. But these communications and advocacy plans are equally as important if we're going to bring everybody on board and support these new approaches. Targeting information appropriately. So, you have your senior Ministry of Education officials, you have parents and teachers. How do we get the word out around the reading programs and different aspects of language that they need to understand if they're going to really come on board and support support a new way of doing something that might, run contrary to their experiences or their beliefs. Using appropriate media. There's a lot out there. There's briefs for parents I've seen on early grade reading programs in mother tongue languages. Adrian brought up that infographic from the Asia region. Radio and television have been used in Ghana in the past to talk about L1-based instruction there. So thinking about targeted approaches and how programs can use different media effectively. And then lastly, sharing experiences and results along the way. That's something we don't often do, I think, as regularly as we should. We do assessments, we gather information, maybe it informs the program, but we don't often share it back with parents or with teachers on a broad scale to say this is how this new approach is doing, much more broadly than just what you might be experiencing in your classroom or your community. And that's really an essential part of how we're sharing and advocating about language issues. Handout 13 is a policy brief that one project developed to talk about effective approaches to transitioning to English. Again, targeted towards a particular stakeholder audience, but a nice brief to show you some of the materials you might consider developing if you haven't. So just in the last couple minutes we have here, just wanted to do a final reflection on these key steps and considerations that we've been talking about. Thinking through all sort of 10, if you can remember all 10, which of these have you found to be most challenging? Or where have you found you've been most successful? Again, this kind of gets back to the needs assessment we did at the beginning. If you want to share anything about your successes, what guidance you might have to others, and if there's any sort of outstanding information needs that you have, we'd love to hear it here. If there's something we missed, we didn't answer your burning question that you brought to this webinar, please take a minute to share it with us now, and we'll do our best in the time we have left. Wilfred has a comment that a lot of new graduates from teacher training colleges or district basic school supervisors, if I understand correctly, there's only a few of them promoting or are skilled in mother tongue reading and phonics. So there's still a lot of gaps that remain in terms of the trickle up effect of getting all the way up to pre-service training. And I think we would agree that, and Adrian had chimed in, that is really an important piece. And there was a lot of focus on in-service, but now programs are sort of taking a longer term approach to reforming pre-service training, because we're not going to, end the need for the in-service if we don't first train teachers better to begin with. So thanks for flagging that. And if you have any examples or experiences Wilfred to share, we're always happy to get them at the Global Reading Network and to share them with others. Samantha, you have the question about the study in the Philippines and what has come of it since then. I actually have an outstanding query to some people involved in that to actually answer that question. If there's anybody on the call, on the webinar who has any up-to-date information, we'd be keen to hear it. I know there's efforts to sort of continue supporting that program, so we may be kind of in a stay tuned place, but I think it's just great that they even commissioned that kind of a study from the government side as well. I think it shows commitment to wanting to get this right, and if your country is in somewhat similar circumstances, that might be something to suggest as well, and use that resource as an example of what's needed. Eunice had a question about different scripts. Just right on the spot, I cannot think of a specific program if others on the phone have. Certainly this happens in cases where you're talking about like alphasyllabic scripts and then children are also learning English. I can't speak to a specific example or research, but that is the case, and it's definitely going to require a lot more time to help children learn to read in two completely different scripts. I think Ethiopia would probably be one example too, where they are learning in one script their more familiar languages that are spoken in Ethiopia, and then also expected to learn English. Adrienne there can chime in, she said too.
Yeah, so what we did find in Ethiopia is the children learn Amharic, which is a syllabic language which has over 200 graphemes. And it takes them until about the end of second grade to learn all of those graphemes and sounds associated with it. And so in that context, they allow them to completely learn Amharic and, you know, learn how to read in Amharic before they start really focusing on the reading and writing in English. So during those first 2 years, they're studying the oral language of English, but they're not yet learning the graphemes of English or any of the letter sound correlations. They're really just focusing on oral language. And I think particularly when you've got two different scripts, if they're very, very different, like Amharic and English, you definitely want to separate them. And you want to give the children a chance to get good and fluent and have a good foundation in that first language before you give them a second script to start learning. If they're two more similar languages, then you know, you might be able to start introducing that earlier. But if you've got very, very different languages, you want to give them the opportunity to be successful in their first language before we expect them to start performing in their second language.
There's a last call out to a couple more resources. Handout 14 is ideas on strategies to address language-related issues. So it's kind of a summary of what we've been talking about, mirroring the handout you received, the first one on issues and challenges, kind of organized by those topical areas around teachers and materials and policy and stakeholder issues. Might just, again, be kind of a useful brief if you want to have on hand for going through some of the things you might consider doing if you haven't already. And then handout 15 is also a planning tool. It also summarizes what we've talked about into sort of a list format of these different steps and considerations that you might go through as kind of a checklist to see what you've done in areas where you still may want to engage in activities or more research. So a couple of key takeaways before we sign off from this webinar. Just, you know, first and foremost, again, I hope you've left this webinar with understanding and knowledge around how language applies to all aspects of early grade reading improvement, that planning teams and all the partners involved need to be aware of and on the same page about these issues and plan accordingly. That we do need to take time to understand the context and the evidence. We need to know what we don't know. We need to bring together diverse teams of experts and stakeholders to work really collaboratively and obtain consensus on these issues. We need to ground our decisions in evidence and good practices. There's a lot we know about how to approach language issues and instruction. We need to heed that existing evidence coming out of current early grade reading programs to figure out even more what's contextually appropriate. We need to monitor, we need to evaluate and conduct research, and then adjust our plans and practices. We need to, you know, we get a lot of momentum sometimes and keep doing things the way we're doing, but we really need to also reflect and adapt as appropriate. And lastly, we need to communicate what we're doing. What are we finding? What are the challenges we're still encountering? The Global Reading Network is here to really be able to share experiences. So if you have a resource or you have an experience you'd like to share, please send it to us and we can put it on our website. We can turn it into a little case study like many of the ones you've seen here, because I think the more we share across programs and learn from each other, the better. So on that note, I will just mention that we're currently updating a resource on planning for language use and education to really bring it up to date with current program experiences and the needs that we've heard from people working to provide guidance. So what we've talked about today, we're going to be updating this existing resource and hopefully have it available in the early fall with up-to-date case studies and guidance. So stay tuned for that. So thank you for attending today's webinar. Shortly after this webinar today, you'll get an email with a link to all of the materials and also a link to a brief survey. We do appreciate hearing from you what you've learned from this, if there's any other information that you would like, or if there's different approaches to professional development that the Global Reading Network could be offering in the future. So to contact Adrian or to contact me, here is our email addresses at the top. We have some upcoming webinars and events over the summer. If you are not on vacation, or even if you want to take a break from relaxing, You can join us on July 30th next week on Tuesday instead of Wednesday for our fifth and final webinar on continuous professional development. We'll be talking all about teacher training and coaching support. And then in August, if you are in the Washington, D.C. area, we'll be having an in-person training on the Universal Design for Learning Toolkit. We released this last winter. It's been really well received. But we understand there's a need for a lot more discussion and professional development around universal design to support all children learning. So details will be coming soon about how to register for that in-person event. And if you're not connected to us on social media, we are out there and posting about events and resources. And you can also share your resources, and we're able to retweet and share information with the community of practice. So thank you again, and have a good rest of your day or evening.